Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. Kristi Rivait, the co-founder of Segal Collaborative, and her role that she builds cross-sector partnership, delivers programming, and coaches leaders of nonprofits and charities on growing assets and integrating sustainable financial growth. Kristi is also the co-founder of Thrive Impact Fund, which invests in and supports impact organizations and social enterprises across BC. Welcome, Kristi.
Thanks, Mary. It's lovely to be here.
So, we're really exploring potential new models that nonprofits and charities can embrace, particularly post COVID, when they were confronted with so many issues that the pandemic brought, where they were constricted by the way that they were able to spend their funds, and in fact, were frustrated in being able to. Perhaps spend them on things like infrastructure and digitizations and things like that. What issues and problems do nonprofits and charities face when it comes to financial resiliency, and how did you see COVID-19 impact them?
Yeah, Mary, that's a great question. There's been a lot of trends in our sector that have been happening over the last 20 years. I would say there is government contracts that really haven't changed with inflation. Their rates haven't changed with inflation. We've seen a lot more nonprofits come into our society. So if you think about that, they're all going after that same pool of funding. We've seen trends in our funders have shifted. So it's really gone into that innovation and newness in over that long-term program funding. And there's been a real shift away from operational based funding into program funding. I think you're also seeing, Mary, to talk about that digital side is this really increased need for higher levels of reporting, higher levels of data, at the same time that nonprofits and charities lack the base funding underneath to really support the integration of that kind of technology. And COVID, of course, has really amplified that our needs are rising. They're more complex as a society, and that the traditional way that potentially a lot of nonprofits and charities have looked at fundraising through events, donor, and grants has really shifted, and there new models are needed and new ways of doing things are needed.
Do you think that there's a resistance to talking about new financial models and funding sources, things like financial resiliency and financial health in nonprofits? Is there sort of a pushback in terms of exploring these areas?
I would say nonprofits and charities think about financial resiliency all the time. All the time. They think about, how do I keep my staff? How do I pay my rent? How do I service growing needs? There may be a resistance in culture internally inside of nonprofits and externally in our society as whether nonprofits and charities have the right to be able to come from that place of abundance, right? To have good buildings, to have really good laptops, to pay their staff really good wages with benefits. And so I think there's a resistance in that piece, and that's a shifting of culture that needs to take place and is taking place.
Well, now that you're with us today, I wonder if you could provide our listeners with a kind of overview within Canada related to the different kinds of alternate revenue that are accessible to nonprofits and charities in Canada. So what are the options that are available?
Yeah. If you look at nonprofits and charities, they can make revenue three ways. One is through philanthropy, one is through government, and one is through earned revenue. And of those three, earned revenue is the one that allows them to have control of how they're able to interact with community and how they're able to service impact. So if we look at that earned revenue stream in Thriving Nonprofits, one of our flagship programs, we really dive into a honeycomb model. And that honeycomb model really talks about, how do you put enterprising strategies into your traditional strategies like grants, donations, and events? How do you look at fee for service? And what we see is that sometimes organizations are actually able to amplify their impact when they're able to utilize their grants to service specific community members and actually charge a fee for service on some of their programs and initiatives. We see social enterprise. That could be inside an organization or that could be outside where the nonprofit owns that entity. We see partnerships, and that's really going above and beyond the hi, can I get $5,000 for my sponsorship? To really looking into what does that deep partnership look like for money and other things. It might be distribution, opportunities. It could be many other things that nonprofits can have with other nonprofits, with business and corporations, and with high net worth individuals. Yeah, and I guess one other thing I'll mention, Mary, is also looking at what is the dollars they're already spending and how can organizations look to leverage those dollars through their staffing, their procurement, and all their spending habits to actually leverage additional impact for the community.
Maybe you could explain to those who may not be familiar what impact investing actually is. Could you explain that?
Yeah. There is a continuum of impact investing. So I'll really talk about the Thrive Impact Fund because that sits in investing in nonprofits, charities, and social enterprises, which is rather unique. And there's only a few funds like that across our country. And so we really look at it's equity-like debt. So it is not community is the stakeholder, of course, in nonprofits and charities. So there's no equity stake in there. And it's really looking at how do we service this gap? What we find is that we have so many high capacity leaders in our sector and they come up with amazing ideas, their staff, and they have really impactful programs, but unable to scale those programs and have more impact or buy that piece of equipment, that they then might be able to press their apples into cider, and sell that as a social enterprise, that there's really a capital gap there. And so we identified that capital gap and we brought Thrive Impact Fund to really support BC's nonprofits, charities, and social enterprises to address that barrier to capital. So they kind of get that capital at the right time and the right amount. They really need it patient and flexible, non-collateralized, excuse me, and that is something that is a challenge in our traditional financing institutions, is that collateral. There is no collateral. Community is on the board of directors. A board member is not putting up their house or something like that. So it's really looking at it differently to identify and how do we service that gap and remove that barrier to capital so that after they're able to then leverage themselves into traditional financing.
Okay, so can you explain what exactly the impact investor is actually investing in? I mean, for in for-profit companies, obviously the investor expects a financial return. And how is that different or the same as the impact investor?
Yeah, there's a few different kinds of investors. I would say that sometimes investors are looking to um, all of our investors are looking for impact. So we also would only pick people looking for impacts. So they're looking to maybe be able to see their grant dollars go further because they are able to put their some resources into an impact fund that allows them to have a non-principal, just their principal returned. Okay, so they're actually looking to how do they stretch their granting dollars further and have more impact. The other way is that some investors are really looking to utilize their capital to make change. And so they are looking for that really high impact driven, but they're looking for a modest return. So we have one of our class shares as a modest return for an investor. Yeah. So I'd say what I feel that is happening is that people really want to put their money for good. And they're noticing that if they can go into a true impact investment fund, then they're able to sort of make the change they want to see in their backyard.
And why would they do that as opposed to give a donation to a charity, for example?
Yeah. Well, for Thrive Impact Fund, it's an evergreen fund. So that means it sits in community in perpetuity. And so that money, so let's say you put in that 250,000, right? If you see that in an evergreen fund, it continues to recycle into community. It's paid back, then it recycles back into community. So where as a grant or excuse me, as a donation would be a one-time gift, this can actually have multiple effects that continue to give to community over and over again.
And I'm curious also to understand, in terms of the organization, what do organizations need to have in place in order to successfully take advantage of these different forms of revenue? What sets them up for success?
I would say that they need to really be at that place of or open to learning. What does it look like to bring entrepreneurial thinking into an organization and have a board that is open to looking away from risk as a bad thing, but go into a place of risk as mitigation. And how do you mitigate against risk and take opportunities? So it's that same comparison between a fixed mindset to a growth mindset. Right there's this place of just a shift in thinking that things are learnable. They have clear impact goals. They have a board that might be open to looking at how do we service our community and create the impact that we want in different ways, right? And so all of that kind of thinking, there's a culture that happens in an organization. Staff may suggest ideas, they can try it. Failure could be part of that process. They test and pilot quickly, they learn, and so that they're able to really bring that culture into the organization. And that is to say that not all organizations are in there, but that's why organizations take things like thriving nonprofits is how do you learn to integrate that into it? What is that shifts that we may need personally or as a sector that shifts us from scarcity thinking into abundance thinking, right? And those beliefs around money.
So you talked about the kind of instrument that would be a debt instrument, for example, and I think you said that they wouldn't be collateralized in the circumstance of, say, a nonprofit or charity. Is that correct? Did I hear you correctly?
Yes.
Okay, and so in that instance, then how where is the how do you get paid back? And I presume that there's some sort of interest as well in the instruments you use that pays for that debt that would come like it would if it came from a bank.
Yes, that is correct. That is correct. So the fund really does the management and the work it does on that split between the interest and what the investor. I would say, I would suggest that nonprofits and charities are extremely fantastic at paying that debt. So we do have a fund, of course, as any fund would have, a loss reserve. But in my experience and the hundreds of nonprofits and charities I've worked with, they're excellent at paying things back. They're accountable to many. They're accountable to community.
Right, so historically, they're used to being accountable anyway. So
Yeah.
under if they're a charitable organization, obviously they have to be accountable for how their funds are spent and the record keeping and the CRA requirements. But so I guess they're already set up to I guess govern themselves in terms of the payback of a loan, for example. And so how do you secure the loan then? I suppose is it just by contract? Is it a contractual sort of obligation?
Yeah, it's a relationship base. We really tailor the loan for what the organization actually really needs at the time. So that could be we don't invest, the Thrive Impact Fund invest in initiatives and projects and that already have a year worth of revenue. So there is a bit of a track record already, and they're looking at how to expand that. It might be around, so we really work with each organization. So that might be that what they need is patient, flexible capital. And so they might need not to have to do only interest only payments for the first 6 months or not to have any payments that are due in those first 4 months. So they can get to the place that whatever that initiative is cash flowing well so that they're able to then have no worries around payback. We also have a product that's called revenue based financing. And that's a really unique product. It's in the States and in other places, but Canada, it's relatively new in Canada. And that really looks at a shared success model. And so that means as the profits are coming into that enterprise or that asset, that's when they start paying it back based on the profits that they're making once they're at success. So that really is a shared success model. We wrap all our investees in coaching, and they have access to an amazing set of advisors, mentors, coaching programs like Thriving Nonprofits, and just coaching and consulting. So we're really invested and we walk with them through their success. So we're very confident in the organizations that get investment in thriving nonprofits and that they will succeed. And we help be part of that shared success.
So in the debt kind of financing, can you talk about the pros and cons vis-a-vis a normal bank loan, for example? Why would an organization come to you? I mean, it's obviously you're giving lots of other programs and services to them, and you've talked about the flexibility, but maybe you could address that more indirectly for me.
Yeah, I would say I can speak to my own experience as an executive director of a nonprofit organization. We had an amazing opportunity to be able to purchase 3 city lots in our community, which don't come up very often. And they were attached to 5 city lots that weren't being used. So the community had a vision for an amazing shared model, affordable housing, shared services, a really community hub. And it was when the Anglican diocese was selling off some of their churches. So at that point, we really were excited and we wanted to invest, but the buildings on those particular spots had to be demolished and put back up because the foundation, it was old and you couldn't have children and things like that in there. So we needed somebody to just give us a moment, to give us a year and say, you don't have to pay anything back. And it was for $200,000. That's all we were looking for at that time. And if you think about that kind of a project, that is such a small amount of dollars, but we couldn't pay the debt back from a traditional loaner immediately. And we were unable to find a bank or a credit union that was interested in participating in that. And we even went to some of our funders and said, look, this is like a massive opportunity for community. We need to take it. And they agreed, but they didn't have the resources to be able to support that patient capital. So the impact investment fund, like TIF, the Thrive Impact Investment Fund, really looks at what is that period of time that you need to be able to have that capital to be patient and flexible, right? And so those payments come back. Their debt payments might be different. And again, those kind of different tools like revenue-based financing might mean that you get to wait a bit of a time, and then once you're in success, and then you can, do a payout. So it's just looking at things just a little differently. And again, there is amazing stuff that credit unions do, and we're not trying to fill a credit union spot. We're just trying to say there's a gap here, and there is a risk height that a credit union can only take. And so we're trying to help support the credit unions as well to be able to fill that gap so that then our organizations can then leverage into traditional, let's say, credit union financing or bank financing.
Really interesting example. Can you offer some other success stories or case studies to illustrate how some organizations have really gone through this journey of successfully diversifying their revenue?
Yeah, I can talk a couple that we have just released on Scale's impact report for 2021. One is the Cowichan Green Community Society, and that is a society here in the Cowichan Valley that's really focused on environmental sustainability. So they were able to purchase an asset. And that asset allowed them, and that was a real estate asset. So that allowed them to really co-locate their offices with some of their social enterprise activities. And that asset alone has helped them dramatically increase solving the issue of food waste, of food security, local employment, environmental sustainability. So it was that one real estate asset that really catapulted, their ability for impact, which is just amazing. Another one is the Shelburne Community Kitchen. And that is an organization that's really focused on supporting the lower income people and families with health and wellness. And they focus a lot on this one asset. They had so quickly outgrown their ability to serve um, their community. And that was even before COVID. And then when COVID hit, they just so amplified in the need. And so they were able to, again, uh, secure an asset in a location that's actually allowed them to increase their impact by 225% already. Just being able to to be able to get into that new space. And now they're going to go into, okay, what does it look like when we renovate this kitchen? What more can we do? So it's really fascinating to think about what those small changes can be, or those long, and you build up your tolerance for risk and taking opportunities. So it might not start with purchasing an asset, but it might start with really thinking about how do you shift some of your fee for services so that you're able to use those grants that we had another organization. I don't know if I can publicly speak about them, so I'll just say it's a habitat trust organization. And so they were always doing these bat boxes, and it's a really big problem for them on the one of the islands here. And so they were only had this much in grants, and so they were usually only able to service a small number of homes. But when they decided to think about a fee for service strategy, they went around and sort of talked to all the home owners and renters, and realized that actually there was quite a lot that could afford the fee for service, that they would charge for that. And so they could use that grant money to really support the people that had barriers, cost barriers. And so they were able to amplify their impact by integrating a fee for service strategy into it.
Hmm.
At the
Really,
same time, continue to service, and actually service more people that had cost barriers to accessing their programs.
wow, really interesting. So, what are some of the key challenges that organizations face when they're trying to diversify their revenue?
I would say that there is a cultural shift that does take place. I have seen many entrepreneurial executive directors whose wings are clipped, I would say, by a risk adverse board. And that's a difficult place to be. They sit in that place of scarcity, and then they eventually lose that executive director. Right. I'd say financing is a key challenge. That piece around getting that access to financing, and grants are critical, and they will always be so important for nonprofits and charities for piloting and testing and research and development. But grants cannot be used for capital purchases. They can't be used for like those asset acquisitions. They can't be used to pay off debt. So there's places where they're not able to resource what the organization needs. So that challenge, and that in credit unions and financial traditional, you have to collateralize those loans, and so that is a key challenge for organizations. Yeah.
So, do you think that diversification works for all types and sizes of organizations? Are there different challenges faced by small versus large organizations?
They work for all organizations and types of organizations. I will say that Scales always, has traditionally worked with organizations that sort of sit between that sort of 500,000 to, let's say, $2 million place, because they're at an interesting place of their maturity of an organization. And that's when they're starting to look at diversification. Through COVID, though, we've really been flexible in our different programming and coaching and consulting, and worked with organizations from, really small to the 10 million and above. So it's fascinating if you start to think about it. It's really apples to apples. Those diversification strategies work for all types of organizations. Saying that, there's different challenges and opportunities depending on your size. So if you're small, you're nimble. You can test and pilot quickly. You can shift things. You can change things. You're also not burdened with having offered a program maybe for 20 years in community for free, right? That change management piece. On the other side, when you're really large, you slower. There's more to go through, more processes, more structures, more systems. But you also you might be sitting on a bunch of cash on your balance sheet that you can then purchase an asset. So, there's challenges and opportunities for both sides.
So, if an organization is interested in diversifying, what would you suggest to a leader or a board member who wants to prompt discussion at their organization but is facing resistance? Like, what do you coach them to do?
I'd say it all begins and ends with impact. So I would start with, what is the impact that you really want to have for your community? And is the way you are doing things getting you to the impact that you want to have? And is there other needs that your community needs? And then really think about revenue diversification. We're not talking about revenue diversification for revenue diversification's sake. No one's getting rich here. Community owns nonprofits and charities. The wealth that is built in our community. We're really talking about revenue diversification to increase your impact. So, really, to have those frank conversations, to bring someone in that might help facilitate that conversation. And when you are ready, look at something like Thriving Nonprofits, because that takes your organization, your staff, your executive director, and your board level through that type of a process of really identifying and outlining what could diversification look like for your organization at this point in its history. You're not going to integrate all strategies all at once. You're going to pick one or two that are really allow you to have the impact that you want.
Now, I'm curious whether you happen to think that the We Charity scandal and sort of the public sort of exposure of some of the governance issues that apparently were unveiled will
Mhm.
discourage organizations from considering some of these alternative revenue streams and operating models. Did it have a chilling effect?
I would say if we look at the broad sector inside organizations and out, I would hope that one social enterprise would not color the amazing work of 170,000 plus organizations in our country. The same way as we didn't look to business with the SNC Lavalin scandal and assess all the businesses. If we look at every sector, there are going to be people who follow the rules and there are going to be some people that don't follow the rules. But we always advise our organizations on really to make sure that their structure and that their activities really fall within the CRA guidelines. Um, and yeah, in my experience, we work with so many organizations and nonprofits that are doing really, really great projects and really great work. And they're really looking for a way to resource that work. And the We scandal is a real anomaly in the sector. So I really hope that society and organizations don't shy away from it if it's the right strategy for them and really look at it. We are talking about a sector that's 8% of our GDP.
What are your thoughts on the current legislative framework governing how organizations operate in this space? And do you feel that there are changes that should be made?
Well, the federal government did put an advisory committee on the charitable sector that has released some things that the charity sector would like. I'd love to highlight a couple that,
Sure, please
that
do.
I really agree. One is our sector does not have a minister, and that is on 3 levels of government, 8% of the GDP. So we do not have a minister that is able to use that voice to really, strengthen and support the real social, economic, and environmental powerhouse that this sector is. So first and foremost, we need a minister. Right? I'd say a couple other things. There is a lot of, increase on reporting. And is there a way that we can look at this more as a standardized way? Can that be co-created with the sector to sort of, support the sector not having to report in many, many, many different ways for many, many, many different funders to really sort of have that standardized, which I also think would really support us to be able to see impact, not from a silo based perspective, but really over and how it overlaps. And I would say the third one is really around foundations. Foundations currently are required to disperse 3.5% of their endowments into impact. And that really often is around grants, which is very critical and important. But what that means, if you start to, look back, is you're like, what's the 96.5% doing? Right? And if we start to look like that, that's invested in the private sector in different ways. Is there a way to start having that conversation around how do we shift the required amounts or shift it so that they're 100% aligned or more aligned? I am excited. There's lots of foundations, and we're having conversations with them and looking at how that they can invest for impact. And I think that those three are are key points that our sector deserves, and I hope move forward.
I'd like you to address, the potential critics out there who may sort of wonder about whether there's sufficient oversight and accountability in some of these new models, because clearly that's an important hurdle that you'll have to get over in order to be able to really have the sector embrace these alternative models and more integration of social enterprise and other kinds of strategies. Could you talk about that, please?
Yeah, I think it's really important for us to remember that nonprofits and charities are very transparent. You can look at their financials at any time. They post them a lot. You can have conversations. They are democratically run. There's a board of directors that oversees, and those are community members that oversee that. They're also they're accountable to many. Like, they are really accountable to the sector. So there is levels of accountability that are built in place already in our system that allows organizations to resource things. They're really trying to resource impact. I've always thought, if we think about money, money is value neutral. It's what we do with money that matters. And the more we can think about how we allow nonprofits and charities to be able to generate different revenues, it helps them weather financial ups and downs like COVID, things that are beyond our control, because one stream goes and the other one can balance it out. And again, transparent, democratic, accountable. Like, these things never change. Every year they have to have meetings that they report out to the community. They put in their societal reports. They have to put all their information into the government. They tend to have really accountants or bookkeepers and other professionals that are supporting them. And so, yeah, I think I think there is a lot of layers of transparency. And you can go to your community organization and just sort of see, can I see all your different past financials, right? Once they're approved, those are all open documents. You can look in it, you can ask questions. Yeah, I think that it's important that we just know that those structures are actually really embedded in our society.
Thank you very much for joining Charity Village Connects.
Thanks, Mary, for having me. I look forward to it.